Forget
I
that.
am recording now as well, and I'm going to start the timer now.
I
And now I'm going to start playing the music and start reading the thing. Okay?
all right.
Good luck. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Partially Partisan Podcast, where we approach controversial political topics, encourage political discourse, and dissect partisan arguments in a nonpartisan manner.
Wait, damn it! I should pull up the Google Doc
Yes, you
because
should.
you froze for a hot second and I didn't know if you started.
Well, I read stuff there for like 20 seconds.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm going to
No, that
restart.
wasn't 20 seconds. That was
That
like
was 20
5 seconds.
seconds.
Okay. All right.
Are you ready?
Yep, ready.
Okay. So I'm starting the music again. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Partially Partisan Podcast, where we approach controversial political topics, encourage political discourse, and dissect partisan arguments in a nonpartisan manner.
Yeah, we were really talking about this idea the other day when we mentioned in discussion that there's just so much political discourse that's going on, but it's really biased, and not just biased, but extremely partisan. And we're just trying to find news that's not this way, and it's objective and factual and logical, but we couldn't find any, so we took it upon ourselves to do this.
Exactly. So I think to talk a little bit about our approach for this podcast, what we're going to be trying to do, our goals, and why we decided to start it in the first place. So we've noticed that, again, as David said, there's a lot of biased news sources and a lot of biased information from both sides of the spectrum. And we're specifically talking about American politics here. But our goal is going to be looking at kind of both sides of the story. And based on that, trying to find some kind of truth that is not necessarily based on people's opinions or prejudices, but instead based on facts and historical data. So, for example, we're going to be looking a lot at statistical data for previous elections and seeing how that might have influenced or might be used to predict the next election. And we're also going to be looking at a lot of original research sources that we make sure are credible, and that way we have a better idea of actually what is closer to reality.
Yeah, we should probably mention at this point that neither of us really has a say in this election. We don't have a skin in the game because, well, I'm 17 and Stepan isn't an American citizen yet. So it kind of allows us to put our biases behind us because we're not as invested.
Exactly. I will say that I've been in America for over 5 years now, so you can. I would say I have a good understanding of American politics, and even though I still cannot vote, I have an understanding of both sides of the story and kind of why people choose to be Republican, why people choose to be Democrat, and the main arguments on both sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah. So today we're going to be discussing four arguments, if you will, for plausible lines of thought for who will win the election. And I'm going to start this off with a model by professor of history Alan Lichtman, who you may have heard of on the news. And what he did, he's created a model that's accurately predicted the outcomes of every presidential election since 1984, excluding the 2000 Bush Gore election, in which he did predict the correct popular vote.
That's a pretty good result, I'd say, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's it's pretty consistent, and I think what's even better is when you take his model apart and look at the individual aspects, and you see that a lot of those aspects, even by themselves, are quite reliable, right? And so what he does, he has 13 keys, and what you do, you look at these keys from the perspective of the incumbent party, and if you can have a majority of these keys in favor of the incumbent party, then the incumbent party wins. Otherwise, they lose and the challenging party takes over the White House. So the first four keys are political keys. The first one is the mandate key, in which the incumbent party increases their number of seats in the House of Representatives. You got the second key, which is an uncontested nomination, as in the case of President Trump. You've got the incumbency key, in which the incumbent party has the incumbent president as their candidate, and then you have a lack of a significant third party. So those are the four political keys.
Okay, so I'd say before we go any further with these political keys, having an example will be quite useful in understanding how the model comes into play. So let's go, I think you mentioned the first key has to do with the House of Representatives. So looking at, say, the upcoming election of Trump versus Biden, who's getting that key and why?
Yeah, so that's a good thought. And the answer would be Biden. And if you look at the model a little bit more closely, it's not just an increase or a decrease. Specifically, we're comparing this election cycle's midterm campaigns that would be in 2018 with respect to the election, to the midterm election of the previous presidency. So that would be 2014, right?
Okay, yeah.
And we've gone from 247 seats by the Republicans in 2014 to only 199. So that's a sharp decrease, and this key goes squarely to Biden.
And so that also corresponds to an increase in Democrat seats. So what would be the original number of Democrat seats in the House?
Actually, I don't have the numbers, but it actually doesn't even matter. All we have to do is look at the number of seats that the incumbent holds. And it actually doesn't matter who holds the House either. We're only talking about increase versus decrease.
Okay, so let's say we have the number of Republicans in the House decrease by 1 from the previous midterm elections, if I understand correctly.
That's right.
Then the party corresponding to the increase gets that key.
Yeah, that's right. On a technicality, but then it would be kind of weaker. But again, we have 12 other keys to look at.
Okay. So now we understand that Joe Biden gets that particular key, and that's kind of a point in his favor. But you mentioned there's a bunch of others, so let's go through some of those real quick.
Yeah. So the second key is the uncontested nomination. For example, no one has ran against Trump for the Republican candidacy, so he gets this key. He also gets the third key because he's the incumbent. Yeah. And he gets the fourth key because there is a lack of a significant third party. And in the context of this key, a significant third party is one that takes 5% of the votes.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think it makes sense from a statistical standpoint, because usually when we consider statistical significance, we have something called a p-value. And if a p-value is generally less than 0.05 or 5%, then something is considered statistically significant. So in this case, having at least 5% of the votes would make sense as a way to show that the third party is a significant player in the election, even though it might not necessarily win or has a very low chance of winning.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, because you do have to consider all of the keys, especially if one of them is weaker. And so let's look at the performance keys. This is actually the bulk of it, because according to Professor Lichtman, the American people are not as easily swayed by theatrics and campaigns. They look to past performance. So this is the performance keys, and you have the short-term economy, the long-term economy, policy change, a lack of social unrest, a lack of scandal, a lack of foreign or military failure, and inclusion of foreign or military success.
So at least looking at the economy keys, I would guess that Trump is losing in both, right? Because of the coronavirus pandemic and seeing how that has affected our economy. I think it has very big implications on both in short term and a long-term scale, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the short-term economy, it's a little bit interesting to consider, because Professor Lichtman, he mentions that while the key more or less rests on there being a recession, this doesn't have to be like a very narrow definition. This is more of a public sentiment thing, because even economists can't agree on a universally accepted definition of a recession. It's just whether the economy in general is in decline during this fall season.
Okay, so Trump gets both of those, or sorry, I guess Biden gets both of those.
Biden gets both of those, because the short-term economy and the long-term economy is bad.
Okay, so can you remind us what the tally is right now for Trump versus Biden as far as the points that we've considered?
Sure. So Trump has three keys: uncontested nomination, incumbency, and lack of a third party. And Biden has three keys: mandate, short-term economy, and long-term economy.
Okay, so they're coming pretty close right now. So let's talk about the other keys as well.
Mm-hmm. So you've got policy change, significant policy change specifically. And what this does is it signals a strong and decisive president who can maneuver the political waters and get things done. And Trump has, well, let's just talk about his tax cuts, for example. That's pretty significant. He's also appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. That's pretty significant. So all in all, this key more or less goes to Trump.
That's true. So, well, a lot of people might disagree with what he's doing. I guess we can all agree that he's doing something rather than just sitting there and doing nothing.
That's right. And then you have a lack of social unrest. And of course, there's all sorts of social unrest in the country right now, whether it's protests, riots, or whatnot. And the key thing about this one is that these have to be sustained social unrest with unresolved concerns and a fear that the social fabric is coming apart. If it's an isolated incident, it doesn't count. But
well, I think definitely that with what's going on right now, that classifies as ongoing social unrest with the possibility of the social fabric being torn down. That's a pretty accurate description, I would say.
Yeah. So we've got one for Trump and one for Biden. Now they're tied at 4-4.
Okay.
And now you have a lack of scandal. And Professor Lichtman gives this one to Biden because, for example, Trump has been impeached and there have been other various scandals such as Russiagate. But I actually beg to differ. By his own definition in his book, a scandal required to reach a threshold to turn this key against Trump, that requires bipartisan recognition of problems besetting the administration. This has to discredit the president, question his personal integrity or at least his faithfulness in upholding the law. And while, there have been strong efforts to get Trump out of office and discredit him, these have been anything but bipartisan.
So I definitely agree with that. So I think that's an interesting point. And I wonder if Professor Lichtman's model has had any consideration of how partisan our country has become and whether in the past, say with Nixon, it might have been more a united effort, though I don't know too much on Nixon myself. But now it's definitely becoming more polarized with one side of the of America saying that, well, no, this is completely fine. There is no scandal going on here, and the other one saying, no, this is the biggest thing since Richard Nixon.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, there's a Fox News poll that's shown that 54% of Americans think that Trump should have been removed from office. And while that is certainly significant, that's the majority, that's by no means bipartisan. So I think this key actually goes to Trump because there's been no scandal in which bipartisan support has gone against him.
Okay, but I guess we'll keep this one in mind that it might go one way or the other depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. And then the next key is a lack of foreign and military failure. Not much has happened in this regard. So all that is required. All you need is a lack of failure. So this one goes to Trump.
Okay.
And then you have foreign or military success. And this is another point of contention. To turn this key in your favor, in the incumbent's favor, you need to dramatically improve the nation's interests and prestige. So we're talking Camp David, or maybe even the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was, rather volatile, but ended nicely. And that's the main thing. And, Trump hasn't done anything on that scale, but he has done some things. So this key may go to Biden in a bit of a gray area. And what I mean by that is the peace deals that Trump has been making recently. He's had 3 hostile nations officially recognize Israel as a country. You've got Sudan, the UAE, and one other country that I can't recall. And, it really depends on how you look at it. The media has kind of downplayed this understandably because of other things to talk about. But this is a point of consideration that's in a bit of a gray area, but we'll give it to Biden.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how many, we covered 12 now, right?
No, that would be 11 when we're looking at 6-5. And then you have the personality keys. If the incumbent is a charismatic person who's extraordinarily persuasive, dynamic, or heroic, for example, Ronald Reagan, then this one
Mhm.
goes to him. However, he's Trump isn't these things. He's actually rather divisive, so this one goes to Biden, and we're tied at 6-6. And then we
And so I
have the
go to the
last
last
key.
one.
Yep, we have the last key, and it's actually the other way around. It's the lack of a charismatic challenger, and Biden is not charismatic either. So this one goes to Trump. And if we look at things from this way,
Mm-hmm.
then Trump wins 7-6, so he wins the election. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very interesting because Lichtman gave the scandal key to Biden, in which case Biden won 7-6.
Oh,
So
that's interesting. Definitely. I think
mhm.
with the last two, what stood out to me was how subjective they are, right?
Yeah.
Because whether a person is charismatic really depends on how you look at it. I'd
Mhm.
say a lot of people find both Biden and Trump charismatic, but some find either one just kind of awkward old man, right?
Yeah.
And so, how does Lichtman resolve this issue? Does he acknowledge it in any way?
Oh well, he sort of does in a roundabout way because he makes it very clear that you have to be, well, let's just say it again, extraordinarily, keyword extraordinarily persuasive, dynamic, or heroic. He specifically mentions that it's a once in a generation thing with FDR, right, or
Yeah,
Teddy
yeah.
Roosevelt, these kinds of things.
Okay.
So it's a pretty well defined line.
Yeah, that makes more sense now. So,
Hmm.
and I think so. You said that it's either 6-7 in favor of Biden or 7-6 in favor of Trump. Can go either
Yep.
way depending on how we interpret it.
Uh-huh.
So, first of all, I think that shows how close this upcoming race is going to be.
Yeah.
If someone in this model, and we don't know how accurate it is, but it has predicted virtually every election since you said 1998,
1984.
1984. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, yeah, I think it's going to be much closer than a lot of people might think.
Yeah. But there is one point of, or actually several points of contention that I want to make, right? Um, because let's look at the short-term economy key. Professor Lichtman actually highlights this in his book, and he mentions that when it goes against the incumbent, that's not a good sign. You know why? Because 9 presidents have ran with the incumbent party during a fall recession, and 9 of those presidents lost.
Okay, so um, are there any reason that's a pretty shocking statistic?
Yeah,
Any idea why?
it is a shocking statistic. Um, and I okay, so first of all, let's consider the sample pool, right? This is a pool of 39 presidents from 1860 up to 2012, not 2016,
Mm-hmm.
right? So 39 presidents, 9 have ran and 9 have lost with this key. And if I recall correctly, this is more or less because of a sense of impending doom. People don't like to keep a president around who has sort of driven things in the short term into the ground.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so you would suggest that it's not looking good for Trump just because of the coronavirus pandemic, and I mean a lot of people are thinking that, but I guess the Lichtman's model is suggesting that as well, right?
Hmm. Yeah. I would point out, however, that um, a lot of polls have shown Trump to be better rated on the economy than Biden,
Mm-hmm.
and also that the Democratic Party has been responsible for what has caused what caused the economic downturn because of the lockdowns. Now, whether this does anything for Trump, maybe, maybe not. Herbert Hoover couldn't really do anything about the Great Depression, but it came along, so that's something to consider.
Yeah, I definitely. I think that it's good that you brought up the idea of polls because I think we're going to transition to our next segment here with me talking more about polls in this upcoming election or whether they play a role. Since I know at least in the Republican circles, the validity of the polls has been widely contested as kind of based on the results of the previous election since they missed virtually everyone saw that a lot of polls missed Trump winning the 2016 election. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about why should we care about polls and how do we ensure that a poll is accurate and consistent. And so I'm going to look in particular at one of the most popular websites that gives the presidential election prediction, and that is 538.com. They're making their own prediction. They've been making their own predictions, I think, since 2010 online, and they've made a prediction for the 2012, 2016, and 2020 elections, the upcoming 2020 election as well. And so I think looking at their methodology will give us some insight into how these polls are play a role in the election at all, right?
Yeah. Just to be clear, these are 538's own predictions and not the sum of other predictions.
Exactly. So, and I think that this is a good point to mention for all of our discussions and all of our segments, is that we do not necessarily agree with the opinions put forth by these people. We are just looking at the data and the arguments from a detached basis and seeing if they hold up to kind of rigorous analysis, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen now to see a particular article. And so this article is talking about an update for the Pollster ratings for the 2020 general election. And so 538, in terms of poll quality, they actually have a whole grading system that determines whether polls have kind of high statistical significance or low statistical significance. And so that's represented in terms of a grade from, I think, A+ to F or C-, whatever it is. So in this article, they basically talk about whether we should be able to trust polls or whether they have been consistently missing results. So I think a couple of key points here that they make is that, yes, polls are not perfect because polls in general cannot represent every single person. Polls take only a sample of people, and so that goes into sampling bias, which later on in the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about various kinds of statistical biases and how those can play in political elections. So as they say here, the absolute difference between a poll's margin and the actual vote share for the 2020 presidential primaries has been around 10 percentage points. And so that is, as they say, some of the biggest error in primary polling this century. And so I think it's important to attempt to describe this error and determine why it happens. But first of all, I would like to focus on the presidential election itself and whether presidential polls are more or less accurate, right?
Okay.
So if we look at I think a bit later, whether the polls actually pick the right winners, that is one of the most basic indicators of whether a poll is right. So if a poll predicts that Biden will win, we can look at whether it predicted correctly or not. It is a good indicator, but it's also a little bit of a flawed indicator, because if we have a very closely contested election, say in some of the battleground states, and one candidate wins by, say, half a percentage point or even like less than a percentage point, then the poll might get something wrong, even though the actual votes were really, really close. And so the poll actually, the accuracy of the poll is perceived to be lower than it actually is. But if we look at the data from 1998 to 2018, is that in general, polls have been accurate around 79% of the time, which is, I would say, a pretty good probability for just a 50-50 guess if you were completely guessing. It is also, you have to recognize, it's not perfect, but it is much better than random chance, that I will say. So, but if we look specifically at the general elections for the president, the polls were accurate 71%, or 71% of the polls were accurate compared to 82%, 82% in 2011, 2012, 94% in 2007 to 08. And so I think the figures are around in the same ballpark, right? So it is not out of the blue. It is not below 50 or above 90. So I think polls haven't changed much in quality in the past decades, right?
Sure.
Do you agree?
Yeah. This is actually highly interesting because it seems to me, and I'm sure it will seem to other viewers, that the vast majority of polls did not predict Trump to win in 2016. So that's
Exactly,
quite a
exactly.
surprising result.
And I was going to bring that up a little bit later, but I think right now we're focusing on poll quality, right?
Uh-huh.
So this is another chart that in which they show that some of the biggest mistakes that polls make are in close races, which makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
If even the people don't know who's going to be the candidate, then how can polls know, right?
Yeah.
So if the margin, the difference margin is less than 3 points, then in all races since 1998, only 57% of the polls have been accurate. While if you have a margin of more than 20 points, then they're accurate 99% of the time. So that clearly speaks to the fact that it's not necessarily some kind of machinations going on with the polls. It's simply that there is often some statistical error that you can't really tell who's going to vote. Is there some person that for example, wrote the wrong candidate that they're voting for on the poll, but then they're actually going to vote for a different candidate. So they do acknowledge that statistical bias can also play a direction, quite a large role in whether polls are accurate or not. But overall, I think one of the most important charts that I found was this one right here. And so it shows that polling bias in general is on average pretty small and also distributed equally, so it does not prefer either party. So for example, if you look at the 2015-16 presidential election, right, we have a general bias towards the Democratic Party of about 3 percentage points, right?
Sure.
And so a lot of people in the last presidential election, they kind of took it as an indication that the polls are lying and that the polls are favoring the Democratic side. But if we look at past elections, such as the 2011-2012 election, we see that in there, the polls actually favored the Republican Party by around 2.8 percentage points. And if we go back even further, we see that similar things happened in the 1999 election and then in the 2003 election. And so if we take the average of all these biases, what they do get in this final number at the end is that you get a very, very slight preference towards the Democratic Party. And so at that point, you might just call it statistical error, right? If it's only 0.3 percentage points, then I would not really say that the polls are biased towards either party, because in that case, you get something larger, such as, I don't know, 1 or even 2 percentage points on average. So I think that this chart does show. Sorry?
Because a lot of people tend to look at polls when they themselves are unsure of the outcome. So it's a little bit of a self-referential thing.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a good reason for why the actual biases over the years might be pretty high, but the average bias over the years might be pretty low. Because if the polls see that, say, for example, that Biden is winning, then people might be more convinced that Biden is winning. And then they would not say, when they were asked in polls whether that they voted Trump, they would say that they voted for Biden. And so that is kind of like a snowball effect leading to these relatively high numbers. But even then, I would say that 3 percentage points is relatively consistent. It's a relatively small error if we're looking at a poll of, say, thousands of people in many different states. Okay, so all of this basically goes into the 538 poll rating system, where they show how they whether they trust a particular poll or not. And so if you give me a second, I will show you. Zoom is being a bit annoying here, but we're going to get through it. Okay, so they go into a lot of detail here of how they ensure that a poll is accurate. But I think some of the interesting charts, again, to look here is which polls are actually the most accurate over the years. So this shows poll performance by simple average error, which again looks at whether the poll was right or not. And so we see across the board that generally polls have around maybe 3 to 6 percentage points of error. And I think the best one across the board is the ABC News and Washington Post poll, which has, since 2008 and before 2008 up to 1998, had only around 3 percentage points of error. We do see, however, that some of the worst doing polls, such as Insider Advantage, have 10 percentage error.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. So it does show that poll methodology does matter, and you can get very different results based on how you do things. And they acknowledge a couple of key factors that have changed since they did this first in 2010. So in 2010, they actually made the case against internet polls, saying that those will be very biased, and the way that you kind of market to people on the internet will encourage self-selection bias, where people from one party are selected or people from the other party are selected. But they've acknowledged that since the internet has grown and expanded so much in the past decade, then that is pretty much negligible at this point. And so they don't include an explicit penalty for poll quality as they did in 2010 now. And they also acknowledge now that it is very hard to distinguish a partisan poll from a nonpartisan poll. And so it is kind of a matter of definition. What do you define as a partisan poll? If a particular party is sponsoring the poll, is that partisan? What if they're actively kind of interfering with who's being polled? So those questions are much harder to answer now than they were before. And another thing that they do acknowledge is that there is something called pollster herding. And so that is the tendency of polls to be influenced by each other. So if a polling firm suggests that Biden might win and another one does that, and a lot of them do that, then a poll might be way less likely to come out with different results saying that Trump is more likely to win. And so that again can lead to a snowball effect where you have all of the polls saying that one candidate is going to win, while the actual reality might be a bit different. And so they go into detail on how they specifically analyze the data. So they collect and classify the polls. They make sure that all of them are unbiased. Then they calculate the average error based on percentage points. So again, if a Republican was to win by 4 points and he won by 9, that is a 5-point error in that case. Then they calculate the average of those errors using a pretty simple math formula. And then they do some variations on that reflect pollster herding, which they mentioned. And so in the end, they get this figure called, I think, predictive plus minus. And so the predictive plus minus gives you an indication of poll quality that they post on their website. So I think here's an example of their advanced plus minus figure. And we see that the green ones are the better ones. So ABC News and Washington Post poll, even by this calculation, they're very accurate compared to, say, again, Insider Advantage that has much higher figures.
Yep.
And so I think these in general give us a bit more indication that we are able to trust polls and that they are not necessarily biased towards any party in election. While we might get a pretty high error for this election, that is not systematic. It's going to be different in the next election 4 years down the road.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a really interesting point to make. And I think it's a good idea to look at things the other way around, right? We're looking at poll quality right now and how polls are influenced. But I think it's also very important to consider how do polls influence voters, right?
Yeah, definitely.
For example, yeah, we could have like a bandwagon effect where people just try to vote for the winning party because, who wants to be on the losing team? But this bandwagon effect, has actually been confirmed sort of in some research papers. There's this 2014 paper by Rothschild and Malhotra, which they ran an experiment on 234 respondents. And what they did is they asked all of these participants to name their likelihood of voting in favor of a particular question. And they had several questions. And then they gave them a random number and said, this is a percent of people who support this issue as well. Now, what's the likelihood that you would vote in the issue's favor? And they actually did observe a significant bandwagon effect. And we can talk about the numbers in a second, but let's get to the argument first. And in particular, this bandwagon effect is prominent when the issue doesn't fall neatly on party lines, right? So this would be, for example, in the case of an independent voter, because by definition, an independent voter is more likely to vote based on the candidate as opposed to the party line itself. Um, and it's quite interesting when you look at the block of independent voters because they actually take up a larger percentage than either the percentage of Republicans or Democrats. We're looking at 30% each for the Republicans and Democrats um, across the general population. And the independents, they take the rest of the population. It's 40% actually. So the bandwagon effect should be stronger with independents. And um, of course, we've seen all the polls predict Biden to win. For example, NBC Biden plus 10, Fox News Biden plus 8, CNN Biden plus 10. So this should, according to the study, influence independents particularly to vote for Biden.
So that's, I mean, that doesn't really make sense to me, right? If you have an independent, then they're specifically trying to not fit into party lines. They're kind of they're proposing their own thing, basically, that it does not really fit neatly within each of the party lines. And so I would think that they would be less likely to be on the bandwagon, right? Because they're more likely to kind of be independent in the direct sense of the word, just going along with their own idea and not just going along with somebody else.
Right, right. And this definitely depends on how you look at the idea of an independent. Um, you could have like a true independent who, might vote for the Green Party or whatever, but then you can have independents who are leaning right or left. And there's been a famous book published about how there actually is no independent voter and everyone just leans one way or another. We can't get too in depth into that because of time constraints. But
Definitely.
I think in general, for example, the country is becoming more polarized. So we can see that even with independents who consider themselves not affiliated with a political party, they probably will align one way or another. And I think that's where the bandwagon effect might take place. But there's another point of consideration
Mm-hmm.
because there's a second study from 2005 about how certain things that candidates do can influence voter turnout. And they noticed that candidate advertisements influence turnout among independents in particular, mostly because these just kind of cast a net into the deep blue sea, um, and thus they're as likely to have an effect on independents as everyone else. But if you notice that Biden is outspending Trump on ads by a 2-to-1 margin in all the key 6 swing states, and you couple this with the bandwagon effect, then that creates a pretty good argument that there's more independents who are going to come out and vote for Biden.
Interesting. So I wonder, I don't know how much will that play in the actual election, because I think a lot of what numbers are, so I think it's good. It's the time we go into the numbers and actually see what is the effect of this bandwagon kind of phenomenon, how large is it, and what's the probability that it will sway voters to one side or the other.
Yeah, it's a good idea because again, if we consider the block of independent voters, it is a significant block. 40%. It's bigger than any other block. But let's go back to the first study, right? And so what they did is they actually ran the ranges of hypothetical percentages in favor of one specific issue from 20 to 80%, right? And what they found was that um, an 80%, in comparison to the 20% figure, you would see an increase of approximately 8% in the likelihood of an individual voter to support a particular issue if the fictional support was raised to 80%.
Okay, so basically, if you raise if people think that other people like around them are voting for the candidate, then they themselves are more likely to support that candidate.
Mm-hmm. And we're looking at, like, for example, the figure they gave on average was, again, 8%, corresponding to 20 to 80% increase, an increase from 20 to 80% of the hypothetical support. So so they actually were able to take this figure and make it so that the coefficient of acted linearly, and so you can see that, for example, 20% increase would correspond to 2.7% more likelihood that the individual voter is going to vote in favor. And I think that's pretty significant, especially when you consider how close this election is.
So I mean, this is an interesting point, but I wonder if this is practical and all, right? Because you said that even to get an 8% vote change, you would need to increase particular opinion on an issue from 20% to 80%, and so that is
Yep.
a 60% increase. And if you look at something like the state level, I don't think that is likely in any insignificant amount of time, which is like less than a month, less than a year. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that is a good point. But if we look at the polls again, we've got anywhere from 8 to 10% on the upper range of big polls, Fox, CNN. These are polls that people pay attention to because of the big name. And if we just take the flat rate, right, we're seeing 10% increase in support for Joe Biden, which should correspond to what's 2.7 divided by 2. You
That
would
is
get that.
1.35, yeah.
Yeah, you get 1.35% increase in likelihood for an independent to vote in favor of Biden. And that's the stuff that tips people over the edge. So, 1.5%, it sounds small, but then again, Trump didn't beat Hillary by that much, especially in some key swing states.
Definitely like Michigan last year.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Yeah,
very close.
And if you look at how Biden is pouring money into these swing states and outspending Trump 2-1 on advertisements, which again affect independents, then all that should come out, according to the papers, a higher likelihood of independents voting for Biden.
Okay, that's a good point, and I think because I feel like independents are not distributed equally across America as per your definition. So what do you say are some of the more quote unquote independent heavy states? So what are some of the states where this kind of campaigning can have the most effect, per your opinion?
Well, by definition, that should be in the swing states.
Okay, so we're looking at Florida, we're looking at Michigan, we're looking at Pennsylvania, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think the reason, so there's something to consider is that most people vote along party lines. Actually, there was an NBC poll that concluded that 8% of I believe Democrats and 11% of Republicans are voting across party lines. So we're talking 90% retention rate, and that's pretty significant. So if you want to have a big turnout, then you want to look at the independents, which is why these studies are kind of significant.
That's a good point, and I think independents. Well, I would argue that those actually are the ones who decide the elections, because you have some electorate, you have some people who are always going to be on one side of the issue. They're a devout Republican, they're a devout Democrat, and they haven't changed their opinion for say 20 years. But then you have a lot of people kind of there in the middle, and they adapt to the circumstances. And so I think those people moving around is what actually causes all of these like contested, well, not contested elections, but very hotly controversial elections, just because they become so close because one person, there's just a little that is needed to take them over the edge to the other side.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what the significance of these studies is. That 1.5%, that could mean Trump or Biden.
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty powerful study. One thing that I do find kind of problematic is that they only tested 234 people, right?
Yeah.
So how significant of an effect is that when you expanded, say, millions of voters?
Uh-huh. I mean, that's a question that we're going to have to wait and see. They did mention that they found their sample to be rather randomly distributed, so that's good. But then again, it was an online poll, and it is more modern. This is a 2014 article, so a lot of the statistical biases and prone to online polling are going to be less prominent, but still, we're going to see. That's all.
So yeah, I think it's also a good point that you bring up. It's made in 2014, and that's before the 2016 election, which I feel like that is when we really started seeing the effects of how polarized the country is. So they kind of, in a sense, they predicted this to happen, right? Because they predicted the bandwagon effect. We kind of have these two sides in America, and they're irreconcilable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so do you have anything else to add in terms of this particular study, or how it affects our predictions for this upcoming election, November 3rd.
No, not really. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all of it. It's kind of hard to consider these studies in the broader context, especially when they're just one study, and it might not be that hard to go around and find another study and just point out and be like, hey, this is a study that has a contrasting result. I think it is important to note, however, that these studies have been cited multiple times, I believe, in triple digits. So that's pretty significant and a rather well-regarded article.
So I definitely consider providing a source for all of our watchers and or listeners to, if you want to look more into the paper, then you definitely can, and we'd encourage you to do so. So I think we're going to transition to the next segment here, where I talk about a very interesting thing that I found while recently browsing the internet. And so I was, considering the upcoming election and what are everyone's chances. And as we know, the polls are heavily in Biden's favor as of now as well. And so I found this YouTube video by a conservative talk show host, Stephen Crowder, who argues that Trump still can win, even with the fact of the polls are heavily in Biden's favor. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at his argument, take a look at key points from the video that he did on this, and analyze them, break them down, and decide whether they hold up to a rigorous analysis, right?
Right.
Okay. So if you give me just a second, I am going to share my screen as well as my video. So yeah, you have to, let's see. So if I play the video, you can hear it, right?
Let's play it.
There you go.
No, we can't hear. You're gonna have to share.
You can hear the video. Maybe I can also share.
You have to share computer audio.
Audio. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
There was a button right there. Okay. So now you should be able to.
I think it's very possible Donald
So
Trump could lose by a landslide, and he could win by a significant margin. All scenarios are possible.
So this is basically the argument that he's making, is that while he's not saying that Trump will win, he's saying that it's much more close than a lot of people think. And so the main point that he kind of goes through is, well, this is what the election map is looking right now. And so we have, as you can see, Biden is with 216 electoral votes predicted right now, and Trump is 125. So clearly seems like it's in Biden's favor. But then he argues that the map is actually going to play out very differently based on based on the polls that we saw last year and the differences that there were. So this is very much of a poll issue. So this is the kind of
had Hillary Clinton up
right
over
here.
On election night, I was as shocked as anybody.
You didn't think it was going to happen.
I didn't think he was going to win Michigan. But here's the thing that's important that the media isn't telling you. The final polls had Hillary Clinton up over 11%, 11.6%.
So exactly. So this is the main point that he's making here about the polls, is that the polls missed Hillary Clinton in the previous election. So let's actually look at some of this data. So we have the polls right now for Biden and Trump, and then we have the 2016 election results, and then we have the predictions 4 years ago for the polls. So for example, look something like Michigan, the polls predicted Clinton to be up almost 12 points, and then Trump actually won by 0.3 of a percentage point. So with these particular states that he chose, right, there is a very clear preference towards Clinton. So we see New Hampshire, 8%, Michigan, 11%, Wisconsin, 7%, Pennsylvania, 7%. And so at least in the way that he's portraying it now, it definitely seems like the polls were very heavily biased towards Hillary Clinton. And so I thought that was an interesting argument. And so I decided to actually look into the polls myself and see if that holds any truth, because I do want to be able to trust the polls in trying to understand if they actually predict what people will vote for. And so I did some of my own analysis a little bit with poll numbers. And so I'm going to share my screen again, but I'm going to share a an Excel document where I crunched the numbers, as they say. So I collected all of this data from Wikipedia. I know that it's a pretty reliable source, I'd actually say, in regards with numbers, and Wikipedia itself sources a reliable political source, which I will link in the description. But the columns that we have to focus on here are column C and column F. So those are the actual numbers. So for example, in Alaska, Hillary Clinton got 34% of the vote, and then Trump got 62% of the vote. And if we scroll to the right, these are in white right here out of the election prediction. So for example, they predicted that for Alaska, they would get, Hillary Clinton would get 47% of the vote, and then Trump would get 43% of the vote. And so what I did is basically I subtracted the poll predictions from the actual results, much in the same way that 538 does. And I looked at the average of those numbers. So we see how these numbers are around 10%, so, or less than 10%. So that makes sense that we're doing the right states right here. But if you look down at the average, so these are the key numbers. We get the 1.02 and the 5.41%. We see that, and what this is basically saying is that polls on average missed Trump by 5.41%, and they missed Clinton by 1.02%. So this, if we subtract the two, we get that 3% average around that 538 talked about for the last election, right? That there is a bias towards the Democratic side for only by a few percent.
Right.
So, and then if you look at some of the individual numbers, so say Michigan, so these numbers are actually quite different, I found. So in the RCP that Steven Crowder links, he has Clinton up by 11% compared to Trump. But here, actually, the polls overestimated Trump's vote by 1.5%. So I wonder if that is just a different selection of polls that have been, that was chosen in his case to argue his point. So I'm wondering as to how reliable it is. But I think what this does show is that 538 and their analysis, they accounted for this. And so Steven Crowder's analysis, if we go back, yes, we have states where Trump got 60, Trump was missed by 16%, right? But also those states were the states where he was going to win regardless, right? So even if Trump, say, wins, if Trump wins in North Dakota, which he will, but the polls say that he's going to win by this much, and he wins by more, then that doesn't actually influence the election at all. He still got those electoral votes. So I think while Steven Crowder might be right here on general, if you look at the averages, it's going to be the battleground states where it matters. And what we found with 538 and analysis of poll quality is that those are not dependent from election to election. So that is to say, even though the polls are saying that we're saying that Clinton will win in those battleground states, and actually, in actuality, Trump won, that might not hold in this election. And so the polls might be saying, giving Biden an accurate estimate of winning.
Wow, that's like really interesting. So is there any way at all to reconcile Crowder's numbers with what we have here?
Well, I think part of it comes down to the polls that are chosen, because again, we talked about poll quality and whether a poll is you can rely on a particular poll. So I think we should compare Michigan polls, say for example 2016 versus 2020, and see if that gives us any indication. So for example, in the 2016 election, it was predicted that Hillary would win with a 3/4 chance. And first thing to note is that 3/4 is, while it's larger than average, there's still a 1 in 4 chance that Trump would win. And so that's definitely non-zero. So I wouldn't say that it is something that we could have there was no way that we could expect that. And I think if we look at the chances over time, those varied even more. So at some point it was 70-30, say 2 months before the election. But I think the important thing that we look at is the polls, right? So here we have the important things to focus on are the grades themselves. So remember, an A+ grade means that the poll kind of is very accurate in general over the years at predicting things, and a lower quality poll has kind of worse methodology or is in some way or shape partisan. But we do see that in all of these polls, Clinton is the adjusted leader, even if some of the higher polls. Well, actually, and while it's the majority of the polls, right, it's not all of them. So we see that some of the polls predict Trump to win. So, and even though some of them are of the lower quality, we had this one A- poll. Right. So, in general, we see that while Clinton does have a very heavy kind of bias here for this particular state in the 2016 election, it was not complete, like, it's not fully out of the blue, pardon the pun. However, if we look at Michigan polls for now, and we can sort them by grade now, which is very, very helpful, we see, I actually found that there is not a single poll that is of good quality that has Trump winning. So Trafalgar Group, if you look through these predictions, is actually the only poll that predicts Trump winning, right? So everyone else predicts Biden winning. And not only that, it is usually around, at minimum, 7 percentage points. So Biden plus 10, Biden plus 8. So if we go down a little bit more, we see that the Biden plus 13 and plus 11, those are big numbers. So if we sort by poll quality and say retain polls that are at least an A or an A plus or an A plus, then we see that those have Biden in the lead, and the numbers are quite significantly greater than what we had in the 2016 election. So again, 2016 we have Clinton plus 1, where the actual poll results not adjusted are Trump plus 2. We have ties, right? And so in that case, it is, while you might entertain, so I know that for people who vote for Trump, they often say that there is an idea of a secret Trump voter that is not really being shown in the polls. So while that might very well be the case, we don't really know about that. We do see that the polls were much closer here. And so the extent to which the secret Trump voter can sway the election could win Trump the state here. Whereas here, the numbers are so large that it's going to be really, really tough. And it is going to be somewhat of a miracle if Michigan does become a Trump state.
Yeah. And I think this like really accentuates the significance of the election because, for one thing, everyone thinks it's going to be extraordinarily close, right? And on the other hand, the polls are predicting currently a very large gap. I think 10% is a very large gap in this context. And so it would be quite horrible for the polling and the news agencies if they got this one wrong, because this is even bigger than last time in your analysis, correct?
Exactly. So if Trump does win in this election, then there's going to be a lot of talk about what the polls are doing and how have they made the same mistake 2 times in a row. And while I will add that while if we look at polls from last year, from last election, say, it definitely seems that the polls might not be, again, so we said that there is a bias from in any election towards one party or the other. On average, this bias cancels out, but there is one. And so the question is, where's that bias towards? So we might guess that the bias is still towards the Democratic Party in this particular election. That is a very reasonable idea. But the question is how much bias there is. So we found that on average there was, or last election, there was a 3% bias, right? So even if we subtract 3% from all of these numbers, almost Biden is still winning in an overwhelming majority of them. And so it depends on how wide that gap is. So I think the secret Trump voter can only do so much. And in this case, it doesn't really look very convincing that they will be able to sway at least this particular state.
Right. So it looks like, according to the numbers, this really is monumentous if Trump wins. And I would just call into a question so many different sorts of um, biases that may be in effect in these polls. And I think it's time that we transition into uh, a little conversation about statistical biases. We're probably going to do one of these each podcast. And the kind of bias we're going to consider today is the sampling bias. And this is defined as a bias in which a sample is collected so that some members of the intended population have a higher or lower probability than others. Um, and so there are lots of questions to ask, right? Given any sample, who is in the sample in the first place, right? Is the sample representative? Perhaps the polls are not just aren't hitting certain demographics, right? And I think in the last election, it was significant that the polls couldn't reach white uneducated males, and so that's a question to ask. How do you get a random sample, right? And then you have to ask, is the solicited response accurate? And this brings into the idea of the secret Trump voter, because according to this idea, someone might vote for Trump but say that they're voting for Biden or simply not voting for Trump, right? You have to ask if the voters are being truthful and who's responding. Maybe the secret Trump voter just isn't responding at all, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
There's something else to ask, and I found this extraordinarily interesting, is who is asking, right? If we're doing face-to-face interviews, then that could affect the outcome of the interviewee's response. And there was a 1988 study that found, and I quote, except for Southern blacks and pre-voting rights act election of 1964, black non-voters in the presidential election surveys of 1964, 1976, 1980, and 1984, who lived in predominantly black neighborhoods and were interviewed by black interviewers, this is key, were more likely to report false that they voted than black respondents interviewed by white interviewers. In addition, black respondents in black neighborhoods who were interviewed by fellow blacks were also more likely to actually vote and endorse civic norms than blacks interviewed by whites. So I think this is quite significant and a very interesting result.
Yeah, I think that's a very big thing, because with all these polls, the question is, are you asking the right set of people? How are you gathering that set of people? And they're also questioning whether you're able, or whether the responses that these people give are an accurate representation of what they're actually going to vote for. And so, for example, I've read some stories of people saying that, according to them, most people hide their vote because they're afraid of kind of consequences coming from the predominant political party, or they lie because I don't know, they're trying to prove some kind of point. But I think it shows that the number of those people is actually pretty small.
Yeah, and this all goes back into how these polling numbers are created anyway, right? Because what if the secret Trump voter actually is far bigger than anything that the polls have considered, and we're going to call into all sorts of questions of like, how did they not get these voters? This is the definition of sample bias, right?
So, yeah. So I think what's, in your opinion, what would be some of the biggest things that can contribute to this bias if it exists on a large scale?
Yeah. And because we are at this point, we are pretty much talking in hypotheticals, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because we're questioning the poll.
Exactly. We don't know if there is
whether
bias.
They can hit the right people. Yeah. And of course, we've already brought up the example of the secret Trump voter. But I think it's also supremely important to consider the medium in which these polls are getting their numbers. For example, if people live in the mountains, have bad internet, then they're far less likely to respond to online voters, right? And we know that, for example, West Virginians who work in coal mines are more likely to vote for Trump.
I think that's a fantastic point, because one thing that I noticed when looking at the poll grades is that there's a very popular website called SurveyMonkey, which collects polls, and so that they have a Pollster rating of C-, and so that kind of surprised me. It turned out that they generally lean very heavily Democrat, and so I was wondering why. But now it makes sense, right? Because if we look at something like the internet, people in major cities are much more likely to have internet than someone in a rural area, say in West Virginia or in some very rural place. But then that explains that if Democrats are more likely to have internet, because it is generally true that Democrat-leaning people are more localized to urban centers as opposed to being more spread out in, say, the Midwest, then that explains why the SurveyMonkey would lean Democrat, right?
Yeah, and I think this really speaks to, well, sort of the diversity of, how the conditions in which people live. Even in the big cities, we hear all the time about power outages. And this is in a big city. Just imagine what life is like in more rural areas where there's only one stoplight in the town or something, and think about internet access over there. So that's pretty significant.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways, just in general, is not to assume based on your immediate surroundings things that are going to be true about the whole country, right? So if you're in a primarily liberal environment, that does not necessarily imply that everyone in the country is going to be liberal as well. And so being mindful of this really wide range of perspectives, political perspectives, can be a really good thing when trying to understand how politics in America works.
Yeah, we don't ever exist in a vacuum. It's pretty easy to say everything's relative, but that is true in some sense. But I think it's time that we look back on all the arguments we've made and kind of take stock and sort of predict who's going to win the election based on these arguments, right?
Definitely. I think so. So our goal now is to actually look at each of the segments that we covered and determine if the other person who was listening to the argument was at all convinced by the particular model or idea that they had. And based on that, we're going to kind of make our prediction for this upcoming election. And that's one of the reasons that we're airing this first episode so close to November 3rd, is because we want to have our say in predicting or trying to predict who will become the next president. So starting with your argument.
On that note, let's look at the first argument. So the big question is really whether the argument is stronger that Trump is going to win, or whether you can tip it back over and bring that one key of scandal back to Biden's side, right?
Right. So the key point in Lichtman's model was can you remind me, international successes or international?
International success is minor compared to scandal, which he explicitly outlined.
Scandal, that's right. So whether there was a scandal or there was not. I think we can judge whether there was a scandal just by how polarized the country, right? So the scandal might occur if a scandal is on a national level, then there's going to be a lot of people who dislike the current president. And according to the approval ratings, Trump has some of the lowest approval ratings than any president in the past half decade. So I would argue that we give that point to Biden.
So that's interesting. Would you consider the scandal to be bipartisan, because he does explicitly outline that?
Yeah, exactly. Because even in, say, Fox News polls, Trump has a lower approval rating than a disapproval rating, and it has universally across almost all media sources, even ones that he are in the same party, they do show a higher rate of disapproval.
Yeah, but the big question is it bipartisan, right? And I think because there's some interesting things you can do in YouTube comment sections. Just scroll down, and if you look at, like, for example, Fox videos on the Trump impeachment, it's all about how he's innocent, right?
Yeah. But, well, I mean, do you kind of agree with my point that we should give that point to Biden?
I think it's highly contentious, and I'm actually inclined to give it to Trump, because Lichtman even mentioned the Watergate scandal and said that it didn't go against Nixon because it was ongoing at the time, and so it looked partisan. Okay,
that's so that shows it. So I think we just split the point in half, right? And that's going to be a tie there, right? So that way we kind of eliminate, we have a certain prediction with the other 3 points. So with my point about poll quality, would you say that this means that polls are more of an accurate reflection than we think, even given that there might be some error on average.
Yeah, I think one big question to ask is, does 538 have any sort of maybe implicit bias, given that they are a polling agency themselves?
So they're not a polling agency. That's right. I want to clarify. They just collect and analyze the data from other polls. And so what I do appreciate about them is that they have all of their methodology explained outright, right? So they're not trying to hide anything. And so based on that, it feels like they really have no stake in being biased towards one place or the other. And so they just do what we're trying to do and give the most accurate prediction of the election.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, Nate Silverman, the guy who did 538, actually stopped certain to not influence voters, as we saw the third point. So yeah, I think I might say that even a little bit against my will, I would be convinced that the polls are, accurate to enough degree that they still correctly predict Biden, because we're talking 10 points versus 3, right?
Okay, so then that's a point for Biden, at least as far as the things that we're discussing goes. So then let's talk about your bandwagon argument. So would we be mainly looking at the campaign, at the ad campaigning, right, and the independent voters?
Yeah.
So what's your verdict there? I mean.
Well, for me, I think there is something to consider is Trump's sort of notoriety. He did beat Hillary, even though she far outspent him even more than Biden is outspending Trump. And he's such a prominent figure in the media that there is a possibility that the advertising sort of point plays a smaller role, but still. I'm gonna say, like, considering the numbers in a vacuum, we don't know how independents. I mean, like, actually, I do know they split pretty evenly, right?
Yeah.
If you look at Gallup's numbers, they split pretty evenly. So, is this the edge that could push independents over the edge? I'm actually not sure, because again, we have the 3% margin of error by the polls, right? And that's bigger than that's about the same as the little margin of error that we say is gonna push the independents over the edge. So I'm not sure. What about you? I want to.
Yeah. So I think the main point that we can take away from this bandwagon effect is that at least this is my prediction, is that states that voted Trump 4 years ago are going to vote Trump again in higher numbers. So based on my prediction and just looking at this bandwagon effect, you would have again more polarization, and so some of the states. I think that there's less likelihood that they will go over from Trump to Biden. So I think, for example, Texas is a prime example. It's becoming a swing state. And so I don't necessarily think that is true just based on what Texas has voted in the past. So I would say that is I would say it's a point for Trump, just because Trump won the 2016 election. And so looking at the past, we can see, well, it definitely can change. You have that kind of historical basis.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm leaving it to you, because I'm the one making the argument. So if you think it's for Trump, then we'll give it to Trump.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I'm convinced by the argument. So now to look at the last point, and so I think it's kind of related. It is basically the same thing of whether can we trust the polls, but this is specifically focused on the swing states. And the question is, does Trump have a chance in the swing states? And so I think Stephen Kreider's argument presented an interesting point, but I don't necessarily find that it's true, given, again, the average systematic error over the elections cancels out.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, at this point, it's the big question of whether the numbers mean anything at all in that margin of error, right? But again, And correct me if I'm wrong, Biden is outpolling Trump in higher numbers than Hillary is.
That is true for most states, and
Yeah.
it's getting close in some states that are traditionally Republican, such as Georgia, I think.
Yeah. So, if Trump wins those states, then all that means is that polls have gone even worse. And you think they wouldn't want a repeat of what they did in 2016. So either this is all a grand conspiracy or vote actually are leaning more towards Biden. So in this case, it's going to Biden. Yeah.
Well, I'm not, I think so, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because again, the only thing that I'm going off of here is that the average thing cancels out, the average bias canceled out over the years. And so having such a significant bias towards the Democratic Party 2 years ago, that would be pretty significant as far as polling accuracy goes. And for 538's credibility as well as an institution.
Yeah, like I mean, everything's gonna be burning down if Trump wins. Like no one's going to trust anyone anymore. We're gonna have to do a systematic rebuild of all the polling methodology.
I think either way, the upcoming election is going to be controversial, and no matter the result, there is going to be a lot of people angry at either side. And I think the main point to take away kind of from our first episode of the Partially Partisan podcast is that you don't necessarily have to be angry about things, and you can absolutely disagree with the other side, as we did a lot of times in this hour. There's definitely points where I did not agree at all with what David said, and I'm sure that happened on his side as well. Being more rational and collected about it rather than kind of invoking, getting too emotionally invested in it can actually be beneficial for discussing politics and kind of avoiding the very volatile situation that it's been coming to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's good to keep in mind that these studies, these reports, all of these things, these are the sum total of multiple people, and that's inherently going to be more representative of the general population than just your experiences. So it's always good to consider things that you can find more objective and that try to take a broad view of things instead of just opinions.
Exactly. So keep in mind that's another type of bias that I'm sure we'll talk about at some point down the road, anecdotal bias and being more convinced by statistics rather than anecdotal evidence about your friends or family or someone you know. So I think in terms of the points that we've analyzed, the first one we said is inconclusive. The second one and the fourth one are towards Biden. And then the third one is towards Trump, which gives us a net prediction of 2-1 Biden to Trump. And so we are, again, this is not necessarily our opinion. This is just based on the arguments that we've analyzed. But it seems like Biden is more likely to win in this election than Trump, just looking at the numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're gonna.
Again, it would be. Just as an addendum, furthermore, we're trying to be as rational as possible. So this would just, whatever comes out, it would just, if Biden wins, then so does our rationality. And if Trump loses, if Trump wins, then everything goes haywire because we've been as rational as possible. And considering all things in the vacuum, we still think Biden's going to win.
Well, I think it's always important to keep in mind that there's the element of chance. So we're not even saying that somebody will win. We're just talking about probabilities, and we're saying that Biden has a slightly higher likelihood of winning than Trump. And to quantify that would be a whole nother story that we don't really have time to go into right now. But I definitely think that if we made any mistakes over the course of this podcast that you wanted to correct, then feel free to reach out to either me or David. We will provide our emails in the description, and as well as all of the sources that we use for this first episode of the Partially Partisan Podcast. If you have any interest about learning more about those particular sources, we're going to share them down in the description as well. So is there anything else you wanted to say, David, before we close out for tonight?
Not really. Just please talk to everyone you know about these things. If you want to share or comment or whatever, that would just contribute to the discussion. That would also be pretty great. And other than that, I think that wraps it all up. Yeah.
Definitely. So I think as a closing note, if you have not voted yet, you should go out and vote. There's a couple of days left, and this is a pretty big election that decides the history of America in a sense. So no matter who your preferred candidate is, just go out and vote. And I think that's going to be it for the first episode of the Partially Partisan Podcast, where I can repeat our mission, which is to approach controversial political topics, encourage political discourse, and dissect partisan arguments in a nonpartisan manner. Good night, y'all.
The end.